Okay, welcome Alex Hudson to Supply Chain 600 Seconds. You represent Zebra and the newly acquired Zebra company Fetch Robotics. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Fetch?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stefan, and thanks for having me today. And hello to everyone listening. So I'm Alex Hudson. I'm the EMEA account lead for Fetch Robotics. Previous to that, I was working at Zebra Technologies for the past 3 or 4 years. Initially starting in marketing, actually, and then moving over to our account teams in the UK. So I was working across retail and transport and logistics, and then Stefan, as you said, we made the acquisition of Fetch back in August 2021, sorry, and I moved over to this role at the back end of last year. So I guess just to give you a bit of background to Fetch and why we made the acquisition and where that's come from, I think it's really important to look at what's happening in the market at the minute. Globally, there are huge labour shortages, and you pair that with the fact that demand for goods is increasing exponentially. Clearly, there's a challenge there, right? And so how can we address that? I think if you add to that point, when we look at a warehouse operator's day-to-day activities, up to 60% of that can be spent walking. And so how can we as a business help customers to automate some of those repetitive, unproductive movements within a facility, address labour shortages by enabling them to reallocate their staff to more impactful revenue generating activities. And that could be anything, right? From picking to sortation to packing. And so that's really at a high level what Fetch looks to do. What we also say is we try and bulk that into use cases, right? And so we have two kind of buckets. We have conveyance, which is essentially basic material transport from A to B. And then we also have fulfillment, which is our new solution, which came into play at the start of the year.
Okay, and this is an example of how Zebra is investing more and more into intelligent industrial automation. Can you tell us about how these investments fit with the total Zebra offering, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've got a team based out of North America, our Zebra Ventures team, and their role essentially is to continuously evaluate the marketplace. And so for the past 4-5+ years, our teams have been looking at a lot of different companies, making investments in ones that are aligned to our strategy and vision. And then, as I said, in August last year, we took the leap, right? And we made the acquisition official of Fetch. Why did we do that? I think there's probably a number of reasons, right? I think if you look at the customers Zebra are talking to at the minute, and the operations that are using our devices currently, we're the market leader, right? From a retail, T&L and manufacturing perspective. Our goal is to have a touch point on every piece of the supply chain, right? And so from that perspective, Fetch is very much a complementary solution, which works in parallel to the devices we've already got in the field. And so really the justification for purchasing Fetch from that perspective is it just builds out our value proposition further and helps to address customer challenges. I think also on that point around customer challenges, this is a pre-existing company, right? And these issues in the marketplace are very real. And so we've got a real customer first attitude at Zebra. And so what we look to do with Fetch anyway is highlight and listen to our customers and highlight where we can help. And those two main things, as I said earlier, are labour shortages and that increase in demand. So look, I think it's a really exciting time to be a part of Zebra, and I think it's really exciting to see where the Fetch business goes and how it aligns further to Zebra.
Interesting, Alex. Now we're all, I think, very excited to hear about what Fetch actually offers. I suppose it has to do with robotics.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Good guess, Stefan. So we offer robots, right? So we've got the Freight 100, the Freight 500, the Freight 1500, And essentially, what those numbers mean are they're related to the payload capacity. What we look to do is look at the pain points our customers are feeling and try and address those. And as I mentioned earlier, for us, there are two key use cases. There's conveyance, which is that basic material transport. And let me just give you a couple of examples of what we're seeing and hearing in the market from that perspective. Conveyance could be anything from trash and recycling movement. And I was talking to a customer the other day. At the minute, they have a third-party agency come in every night, 10 people at a time, and all they're focused on is removing waste from the end of conveyor lines to the exit, right, where it's being collected. I think another area from a conveyance perspective that I'm hearing is, I was talking to a manufacturer the other day, and they're working on an assembly line building parts together, and all their bolts and screws are in a box next to them. But guess what? When they run out of bolts and screws, they've got to walk half a kilometre to the other end of the warehouse to fill it back up again. From a fulfillment perspective, what we look to do is this is really targeting kind of e-commerce customers in a picking environment. And so going back to my point earlier around allowing workers to focus on the more impactful revenue generating activities, the idea really would be for a picker to be stationary, focused on what they need to be doing, which is essentially the picking, get rid of that walking, and off the back of that, you can focus on what you need to do and don't worry about where you're putting it or, where it needs to be going, right? That's all under control.
Very interesting, Alex. Where do you see, are there particular segments where you see the biggest demand right now?
Yeah, I think so. Historically, we've seen retail, manufacturing, transport and logistics as kind of the key segments. And I think that will continue to be where our conversations are. I think as I mentioned earlier, as demand of online goods increases, clearly retailers and therefore warehouse operators have got to figure out how they increase throughput, right? And that could well be through AMRs. But I also think it's important to say that there are challenges in the market around labour in every single vertical and industry. And so while we're looking at retail, manufacturing, warehousing, we're certainly not limited to that, right? Because there are so many other areas and verticals where workers are spending a lot of their time walking or trying to find things. A nurse in a hospital would be a prime example, right? So how do we get rid of that walk time and allow them to focus on what's really important to them and allow them to focus on their job? And I also think the good thing about that is it then helps with job retention as well, right? Because people can focus on the engaging tasks within their role.
Okay, Alex, here in the Nordics, we are almost famous for going into automation quite early, from the 70s, I think, 60s and onwards, within manufacturing and also later on in warehouse and so on. How do you see the demand here?
So I think, from what I'm saying, I think there's demand everywhere, right? And I think while clearly there are customers who are early adopters and there are ones who are further down in that cycle, my view is that automation varies, right? And so customers may have invested in a parcel sortation machine, right? That's been around for a long time. Or they might have invested in AGVs. But what we're looking to do from a go-to-market perspective is really identify key partners that we can work with to provide added value over and above the service customers are getting today in the Nordics. I think it's a bit of a difficult question because each customer is different, and I think each one has clearly made different investments. I think if we look at AGVs, and AGVs have been around for a while, there's a clear differentiator, I think, between them and AMRs. And let me just give you one example. So AGVs, if there's a forklift in the middle of an aisle, they'll stop dead, and it will be up to an operator to move the forklift so that they can find a new route. AMRs are autonomous, right? Completely autonomous in that there's a forklift in the middle of the aisle. They'll navigate around that and continue on their path. So it's 100% a challenge, right? I think there's demand everywhere for automation at the moment. I think as that increase in demand that has been accelerated by COVID. We're anticipating between 5 and 7 years from an e-commerce perspective. That's how far we've moved forward, and we're not going back, right? And so I think that's a global challenge. I don't think it's just down to the Nordics or the UK or whatever, right? It's a challenge everywhere. When you pair that with what I said earlier about the global labor shortages, I actually think it makes it even more compelling, right, for customers in the Nordics. And that might sound like a bit of a strange point, but let me go into it in a bit more detail. The labor costs in Sweden, as you mentioned, are particularly high. But if I'm a warehouse operator or a retailer, I'm wanting to get the most for my money, right? And so I want to move those workers that I'm paying a lot of money for away from those unproductive tasks, and I want them to focus on the stuff that is getting boxes out the door and is bringing in revenue. At the same time, we want people to be happy in their jobs, right, and enjoy it. And so if we can reallocate them to those activities as opposed to the more monotonous, mundane tasks, I think that's only a positive thing. Just to give you an example, I was talking to a customer the other day, and they've got a guy who travels 15 miles a day, right? It was between 10 and 15 miles. And all he does is he's got a cart and he just moves stuff up and down the warehouse, right? If you're in Sweden and you're paying somebody a lot of money to do that task, to me that seems like you could be using that person in a more productive area, right? And so 100% is a challenge around labor costs. But I think the reality is that organizations are increasingly looking at automating their supply chain, and the reason they're doing that is to drive productivity and efficiencies. And so while labor costs are a challenge, I think there's a way AMRs can actually help customers with that.
Thank you so much, Alex. It will be really interesting to follow the development of Fetch in the coming years. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan.